Okay. Yeah. So you listen to Oliver Traldi. Cool. So yeah, he fleetingly mentioned that he got into some disagreement with you. You know what that involved? Or,
I don't remember the I don't remember the details of the exact time he's talking about.
yeah.
I do remember that he was wondering at some point. I mean, this was at least a year ago or more. What like post rationality or meta rationality was, and what was so interesting and novel about it. And me and a few other people linked him to a couple of essays that were typical of what's considered to be central in this kind of subculture. And he was kind of unimpressed by it and said, like, "Oh, so it's pragmatism." So I guess it bothers him. I think that there are, I wouldn't necessarily call it a subculture, but there are networks of bloggers that write about philosophical topics without discussing pre-existing philosophical literature that has bearing on the topics, and that tends to annoy philosophers a lot, in my experience.
Well,
That's
prag
one reason. I know
pragmatism. I've heard philosopher Richard Rorty belongs to that school, I believe. Um,
yeah,
Stanley Fish, is he part of that school of pragmatism? Are you familiar with?
I don't know if he would call himself that because philosophers often resist labels that are put on them.
Yeah.
Historical American pragmatism is connected to William James, as far as I know. But both Richard Rorty and Stanley Fish, they're much later, and they are more quote unquote postmodernists. So that's a different kind of pragmatism. Even though I think William James and the other American pragmatists probably have a similar attitude, but it's not situated in the same intellectual environment. But this
Yeah.
is pretty much all I know about that.
Okay. Am I taking the term pragmatism too literally if I think that school of philosophy actually sort of discounts philosophical abstraction and wants to bring into it, kind of real world lived experience as to how certain rules and ideas about how things should be are worked into everyday sort of practical solutions. Let's say so you've got philosophy, but then you've got on the ground teaching experience or something, or on the ground book writing experience, or I'm thinking of things that you could more easily connect to academia. But yeah, so is that what they do? They sort of discount overly abstract philosophy in favor of sort of real world practice. Is that what that term is getting at? That school, that notion, pragmatism?
I'm a little bit out of my depth here, but as far as I know, they reacted to a philosophical history that was very focused on like trying to define what truth and knowledge is. What
Yeah.
does it mean for a claim to be true, and so on? What is true? And they reacted against trying to find truth in how should I say this? Trying to find truth like out there as like there's a definite such thing as truth out there in the world, and they wanted to call something true to the extent that it was useful for certain purposes.
Okay.
That's about as far as I know, and I think he related. I think Oliver Traldi related like quote unquote post rationalist thinking to that attitude because it kind of tends to be playful in an almost postmodernist way.
Yeah.
If you define post-rationalism as like, it's not really a school of thought. It's just like, it's more like an art community, people who hang out and know each other and reference each other's work and play around with stuff. It's really taken weirdly serious sometimes.
So
Weirdly
you think you
seriously
think you think
sometimes.
the school, if you can call it that, of post rationalism is more a sort of fraternity of people who just talk to each other rather than something that is somehow has more authority than that, like is just graspable.
Yeah, Yeah, yeah. It's just people playing around and comment on each other's writing, more or less, I would say. But if there's something to it, it's just having similar beliefs as the people that are called the rationalists, but having different attitudes about it. More towards the artistic and the subjective and playful. Yeah, as I said. And I
Yeah,
guess that's similar to philosophical pragmatism in that it's not trying to find capital T truth, but rather not trying to find, the truth about the territory as in contrast to the map, and instead just play around with maps.
yeah. It's more, I don't know, exploratory. It doesn't, yeah, it doesn't take itself as seriously. Everything is sort of up for, I almost said up for grabs, but I don't know. I see pivoting a little bit, I guess. On Twitter, there's sort of an overlap between the kind of anti-woke left who have a sense of humor and don't seem to be so as sort of earnest and moralistic as kind of social justice left or mainstream left. I see an overlap between this anti-woke left and some of the illiberal but on the right types, a little trad, I could say, in that they don't they all want to escape what they think of as a kind of a stuffy, self-serious, liberal, centristy tradition, where the economist might an economist might be the sort of central figure, the sort of archetype they don't want to be like, they don't want to sound like. So they tend to bring in subjective, more artistic perspectives than kind of a rigorous.
Do you mean like they're more irreverent in attitude?
Yeah, that's a good term.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm not that familiar with these groupings. I guess when you're talking about when you're talking about the like the anti social justice left, you're talking more about like socialists with a sense of humor, or
Sort of, yeah. Zizek is kind of a central figure for them, and he's
yeah,
notable, got a sense of humor. The Red Scare podcast people,
yeah,
um, Red Scare podcast people, those two girls, those two women, certain stereotypes about what women are or how men are or how certain ethnicities behave in the aggregate. They're not afraid to let that kind of slip from their lips in a way that someone on being interviewed on NPR might be extremely um, cognizant of how they sound and make as far as generalities about certain subjects in the world. So they don't seem so stuffy in that regard. A
right,
moment
yeah,
said common
okay,
person, but I guess that'll work. Yeah, common person, like your Uncle Louis, your Aunt Helen, the kind of things that they might say after after a drink or two. They don't mind sounding like that, but they're also on the left, and they don't want to be
mm,
true to some kind of bigot. Which
yeah. I think that might be a little. I don't know if that seems a little incongruous to an American. I mean, if that is unusual, that combination. I don't find it particularly unusual because this kind of, you know, I don't know, less concerned about the social niceties, and also on the left, that is not a rare thing where I'm from, because that's
yeah,
to a significant extent, it's a kind of working class attitude, and the kind of insecure middle class attitude is much more concerned about the social niceties.
yes, I'd
Is
say, and
that
that
kind of what you're going for?
right in the U.S. I mean, you've heard the term PC, obviously. That's kind of what it's
Yeah.
getting at. It's like the kind of striving, credentialed, progressive aspirants. They show that kind of nervousness. You can see that. You can hear it. In fact, if you're only listening and listening to a podcast and not watching them or something, you can hear them restraining themselves as they search for the perfect way of expressing something. Whereas the
I know all about that.
yeah, um, I wonder how much that really is actually a manifestation of their worldview, or just the fact that they have a much larger audience, and anyone with an audience that large would be visibly uh, searching for the right way to express themselves and not screw up, right? Like in the same way that someone in a spelling bee is going to be more conscious of their overt behavior and their demeanor and everything. So I don't know. I tend to think that it isn't a manifestation of just being in the spotlight, but rather it is a result of their worldview. Because I've talked to these people in private, and by these people I mean the more uh, social justice, culture war oriented kind of left, and not the kind of class oriented left. They do seem nervous about how they talk about the world. They want to make sure they don't step on any landmines as far as promoting stereotypes and that kind of thing. So they are much more sort of, kind of circumspect.
Well, I mean, if you subscribe to an ideology where it's important to be very, very sensitive to how, the kind of mimetic exhaust you release into the atmosphere when you speak, kind of, then obviously you're going to be concerned about that. But I don't think it is just that ideology that creates that kind of feeling, because I don't subscribe to that ideology, but I feel like that quite a lot myself as well. I mean, I'm quite concerned about how I express myself, not for the same reasons, but rather I would find it very embarrassing if I said something very wrong or very unfair, or if I confidently said something that turned out to be wrong. I would be very embarrassed for myself, basically. So I'm always concerned. I'm always concerned about that, and I rewrite things many times just to say it just the right way. So it's also a personality thing. You're just concerned. You can be concerned about different things based on what your ideology is. But I also think there's a personality factor about how how irreverent or how kind of sloppy with the correctness of what you're saying you feel that you can be. Some people just don't really care whether other people dismiss them or think they are, or think they're saying the wrong thing. I think I've written about that a few times, that I think it is unwise for people to be very reductive or very simplistic, because it gives other people who disagree with them a good reason to dismiss them. Yeah. And to me, that is not something you should do. But I realize that other people don't care about that at all. And it might actually be better if you want to achieve your aims rhetorically to, fire up the base, as it were, and just alienate people who aren't going to agree with you anyway. That might work. And some people might feel that they're more naturally attracted to that kind of style. And then other people like me just could never do that, because there's this little angel on my shoulder that just wouldn't let me behave like that.
Yeah, I realized the way that I was describing that sort of hesitancy and to not sound stupid or something is far too generic to apply to some kind of woke left specifically, because I wouldn't use the word circumspect and then had to go look it up right after I used it to make sure I used it correctly. So yeah, clearly that is not really, that's just too common a feeling to map onto a certain school of
it is, but I think you can kind of project that insecurity in different directions based on what your beliefs are, your moral beliefs are.
Right. There's definitely a concern that if you screw up within the kind of mainstream way of thinking for the left, the ramifications are much worse. Like if you can use the word circumspect incorrectly, but say something about, I don't know, East Asian cultures are more collectivist and less individualistic, and you might get pushback on that in a way that feels worse and is more consequential than saying merely misusing a word that's not too common.
Yeah, I mean it's different to go like against your own conscience, and then there's a difference between that and saying something that will get people riled up against you. I mean that's a different thing. But being purely concerned about your own social standing is one thing, but then having your own moral beliefs that you need to take into account is a little bit different. I mean, yeah, you can both believe very strongly in those ideals yourself, or you can believe that if you don't follow them, you will be punished. Those are two different things. There are intrinsic and extrinsic motivation to act a certain way, and I think for me, I have a certain intrinsic motivation to not look stupid, and I think that is probably more important than people thinking that I'm stupid for writing something wrong, because that doesn't really happen a lot and doesn't really hurt me that much. It's more, I don't want anyone to be able to criticize me in a way that I think is correct. If you understand what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
there will
people
be
might be criticizing you, but if they do it in ways that you don't think is valid, then that doesn't matter so much. So it depends on whether you actually believe the same thing as the people around you.
yeah. There are enough ways to be criticized that you have not yet anticipated without having to give them things that you can anticipate and which you know are
Yeah,
somehow.
yeah,
Yeah. So let's get to a great article of yours or post of yours called "Variations on the Tilted Political Compass" at your site Everything Studies, which is devoted to the notion of well, the subheadline here, if you can call it that, for Everything Studies is "I have an abstraction problem," but you're
yeah.
known for studying the notion of aerosology, which is political disagreement. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
It's kind of funny story. When I started blogging, I felt there was a topic that I wanted to write about a lot, and didn't want to call it philosophy because philosophy is much bigger, and I didn't want to call it rhetoric because that's a much more specific term. And I realized it just wasn't a word that I knew of that described, just general things about disagreements and how it works. So I made up that word, and yeah, things happened after that. I sort of pretended like I pretended that this could be like an academic field that was called that, and integrated a lot of thinking from different fields. And then I kind of developed that idea, like a fantasy novelist might do with their imaginary world. And then some people started to take this seriously, and I guess I did so too. And it's kind of yeah, it's kind of out of control.
Okay, so I didn't know that you had come up with that term actually. All right. Um,
Oh, you didn't?
there,
All right.
there
Yeah.
was the BBC, I believe it was BBC article referencing you. Um,
Yes. Yeah. A few months
or
ago.
was it
Yeah.
Guardian? Was it Guardian? I think.
No, it was the BBC.
Okay. Um, yeah. So that's how did that come about? They reached out to you, or
I don't know. I just got an email from a reporter uh, asking for like a few quotes. He said he was writing an article about disagreements in the workplace, and asked if I could answer a few questions. And I wrote a few quotes for him. Basically, that's it. It was nothing more dramatic than that.
oh, okay. So what do you think the prospects are for people who uh, see things differently politically, somehow, I guess, at least agreeing to disagree? I feel like the term modus vivendi is about as good as it can get, which is a kind of agree to disagree notion. It seems some of the research on this, as far as forcing people to have a conversation, well, maybe not forcing people, but encouraging people to have conversation, only makes salient their differences, and at which point they kind of hunker down on their position, and it makes it more difficult to try and agree. And so the best you can do is kind of an agree to disagree, where you, in a workaday fashion, you just you live with each other's differences without trying to highlight them all the time, because it might backfire when you do that. That seems to be what I've witnessed and what I think some of the research says. So like if you have two friends who politically disagree, it's better to just not try and talk about it unless there's something very actionable, like a certain kind of an object level disagreement that they can somehow orient themselves around, in which case we know how much one has moved to the other's position. But when they're sufficiently abstract, it doesn't seem particularly fruitful to encourage uh, debate or to highlight the differences. Well, what do you think of any of that?
A lot of interesting thoughts there to pick up on. I think it's become a lot more difficult to agree to disagree because in order to do so, we must have at least some understanding of what the other person believes. And that is easier when we can pick apart singular issues that are not necessarily that dependent on other issues for us to make sense of them. Uh, you can isolate your opinion on one single thing from your opinions on other things, and then people will disagree on those. Okay, and then we might be able to come to an agreement that okay, I understand your position on this, and you understand my position on this.
Yeah.
But I think now, where we don't have as much of a consensus reality as we used to have, then the whole, what should we say, the whole library of issues, or the whole list of issues that we understand as issues that you can have different opinions on, they're not the same for everyone anymore. We don't even conceptualize politics space, as it were, in the same way. We connect different issues in different ways. I tend to think of issues as kind of networks. This issue affects this issue because it's the same thing as that issue, and so forth. And as long as we had similar networks, we could have different opinions on each node in the network, and that will at least be understandable. But now, when we live in these filter bubbles that amplify and elaborate on these shared but fragmented realities, these networks we have in our heads of how the issues connect and what are typical examples of an issue or a principle or a problem, they are they're so different from each other that we don't really understand what another person is saying as much as we perhaps did before. Or at least we didn't come into contact with people who had such radically different ideas of how the world worked as we
Yeah.
as we
That's
do
very,
now. And also, of course, with the internet and all, people with more extreme views are speaking to other people with more extreme views than they ever did before. But that's a well understood
yeah,
issue.
I feel a general pressure just by being on Twitter to be uh, somewhat strident and declarative in one direction or the other. There's
Really,
there's
you
a,
do. That's
there's,
interesting. I don't feel that. I feel like I should be very careful.
oh, well, I might just be. It's I think I'm succumbing to sort of fashion pressure because the people who seem to have the largest followings and have the most engagement are somewhat more strident, uh, and
Oh, without doubt, yeah.
and so it's almost so being careful in the kind of arguments you make, even exploring something like aerosology, it somehow maps onto neoliberalism, which is the great thing in the center nobody wants to be. Even though neoliberalism suggests political economy, not this abstract rhetoric around just trying to see the other side. Those things are all kind of bundled up together. So not seeing the other side is more fashionable. Uh, and it's a little bit difficult to get at, but yeah, there's a way in which kind of a long-winded, uh, you know, uh, high intellect goes with a sort of bland business conservative neoliberalism, and you don't want to be like that. Um, and that just
I think it's all right to be like that. I'm pretty much like that, although I wouldn't call
yeah,
myself business
I am too.
conservative. But I'm in the bland center, and I don't mind calling my political ideals bland because they are pretty bland. But I think that's a good thing about politics. Politics should be boring. The problem is, I think today that when you wear politics as a fashion statement, they need to be flashier, more dramatic.